Representar un clásico literario en ballet es enormemente complejo, pero las premisas del Don Quijote de Miguel de Cervantes son de una gran profundidad. Es un relato de heroísmo, amor y utopía. Es por tanto evidente que el Don Quijote reúne los elementos de un gran ballet a condición de que prescindas de ellos. For years now, Don Quixote was little known in the West outside of this, the grand pas de deux that climaxes the ballet. The current visibility of this distinctly Spanish spectacle with its chivalrous conquistadors, spirited señoritas, and Hispanic bravado is entirely due to a change in national policy in its country of origin, the Soviet Union. The October Revolution of 1917 spread terror and bloodshed across Russia. In its wake, Nicholas Sergeyev fled to the West. He could only take what was essential: food, clothing, and the choreography to the classic ballets. A few years later, thanks to Sergeyev, Western audiences got to see the full-length version of Don Quixote for the first time. It was not what they expected. Some, in fact, have been unsettled by it ever since.
I feel that the storyline is too slim when you think of what it's based on, with the Cervantes tale. I think it's too loosely an excuse for good dancing. And I think that there's an element of sarcasm and nastiness and superficiality in the characterizations. No matter how much you want to bring them a depth and an intensity, it's very hard to do.
I had a hard time with Don Quixote because I think it was, it's such a sort of superficial piece. I found it hard to find a character in that ballet. To find things, nothing that I could hang on to and grow into.
In choreographer Marius Petipa's defense, Don Quixote is not the easiest book in the world to adapt to ballet. The biggest hurdle is the title character, Cervantes' senile knight.
Considering that, you know, it's called Don Q, and you expect Don Q to be the leading character, and in fact, he's sort of a sideline. He can play a very important part in the heart and spirit of Cervantes of this. Not necessarily whacked out, you know, guy who's lost his brains, but believes he's on a noble mission. You know, however misguided it is, he's on a noble mission, which is a good foundation, you know, for a ballet.
Fair enough, but that presents another obstacle.
You have a problem with Don Quixote of a ballet whose putative hero is a rather old man. Now, rather old men don't dance ballet very well. So, in effect, what has been done traditionally is to turn the Don into a witness to the dancing, more than as the propagator of the plot.
So you're left with a central character who can't express himself through soaring leaps or daring jetés. That requires the services of an actor. And in ballet, a performer who acts more than he arabesques is called a character dancer.
A character dancer is usually that actor dancer that helps tell the story. But you know, everybody in a ballet company is an embryo character dancer, because we are always something we are not. Even if you're in the court of ballet, you're not really a swan. So that becomes characterization. And that's where it all starts, and then it just broadens out. The character dancers are the storytellers. We have to rely on mime, we have to rely on our faces, we have to rely on reactions.
And if you think that sounds like a lot less fun than being a principal dancer, think again.
The thing about being a character dancer, and this is what you cannot do in ensemble work, is that you can do it just a little bit differently every night. You have this wonderful open field, and you can change the direction that you look, or you can change the way you're thinking, or you can change how you look, because you do go home with these things and you do think about them.
Character dancing is usually the domain of people like this. Cagey old veterans whose handsome young prince roles are behind them. But very few young dancers take on character roles.
Because our careers are limited by time, unlike an actor's, we tend to protect that period when we are at our top classical form by, in fact, refusing to contemplate roles that are usually given to older people or people who do not dance all the time. And that's what frightens us as dancers. Is it over for me? Because we're always frightened about that. When is it going to be over? When are they going to say, someone come backstage and say, that's wonderful, but you should be doing the role of the old man.
But that doesn't mean that character dancers are performers that are all washed up.
Nice to be able to challenge dancers when they're at a point in their life, you know, because there's a stigma, you know, in the dance hierarchy that you go from core to soloist to principal to leading dancer, and then once you're through with all that, you do the character roles. It's nice to engage thinking artists that see that that is an augment in the same way that doing a contemporary ballet, even though they're basically a classically trained dancer, is an augment and a system of growth for them.
Besides, whatever choreographic shortcomings there are in the role of Don Quixote, they are more than made up for in the other central male role, that of Don Quixote's young friend, the barber, Basilio.
Basil, aside from being a very buoyant and exciting and happy role and flirtations and all those qualities, is a technically demanding role. you talk about power. There is a role also like Solo in La Bayadere, like Raimonda. It's flashy and powerful. It's, once again, a role where buoyant, fresh, young spirit is needed. It's the role of Basile. It's like a little red ruby shining constantly. It should never, the light should never disappear. It should always be bubbling and shining.
It was great fun. You know, there was no psychological depth that I could find in this barber. So it was just a romp.
Another problem with adapting the book Don Quixote to ballet is its episodic and often philosophical nature. But Petipa got around that one easily enough. He simply retained the exotic locale and the central characters and replaced them with 2 hours of non-stop pyrotechnics. Boy, they would have loved him in Hollywood. What's left is an errant knight who, dreaming of chivalry, is destroyed by his own pursuits. Don Quixote is also involved in the complicated union of an innkeeper's daughter, Kitri, and the barber, Basilio, and their plan to flee Barcelona.
If you feel that that's a sense of betrayal of Cervantes, I would be in your camp. However, strangely enough, it does work as light entertainment, and it works very well as an sort of an exhibition of bravura dancing. That has never been denied. It dances, 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 and never stops dancing.
Of course, given the story's Spanish setting, what could one expect?
I must say that the actual Latin side, to myself, helped me immensely interpreting the roles that needed that Latin flair.
You know, it's exhausting. You know, you finish the first act only, and you feel like you have no energy left, because like even when you're not dancing, you have to be with full energy, because that's just, you know, the Spanish temperament, you know. And so even if you're not doing the steps, but you're on the stage, you have to be full energy. You can't be a little relaxed here or there. You know, it's full energy all the time.
The Spanish flair and fire is no doubt what attracted Petipa to the property in the first place. And it's attracted just about every dancer since.
I used to enjoy doing Don Q.
You get better reception this way.
I enjoy temperament in dancing. I enjoy other people with temperament, and I enjoy having roles that have temperament. You know, a bit of fire, a bit of, you know, sauciness. And that role allowed that kind of slightly over-the-top sauciness that was fun to do.
Ordinarily, this type of dancing isn't that much of a poser for a dancer. But in Don Quixote, there's an added twist. Petipa's choreography isn't entirely faithful to the idiom. Like my segment off the top of the show, it's more like broken Spanish.
It's a special style. It's Petipa style with Spanish style, classical Spanish dance.
What Monique is alluding to is Petipa's ability to import a Spanish style over the classical form. Kimberly will demonstrate some steps from her third act solo in a purely classical way. These same steps now with a Spanish style. And you have to be sure-footed from the word go. Don Quixote is not the kind of ballet you wade into. It's the kind of ballet you jump into with both feet.
Suddenly you jump into the role with the most difficult technical steps, and the variation is very long in his ballet.
Three acts are very different, because in the first act you have to act a lot, you have to play, it's a little bit of humor scenes, you have to dance, a lot of variation, but it's to play. In the second act it's so different, it's what is imagination of Don Quixote, so you have to be, like in the second act of Giselle, immaterial. In the third act, you are a woman. It's the wedding, and it's a serious part with a lot of technique, but it's always a Spanish style.
I found that it wasn't so much about the style, it was about channeling your energy in a certain direction. But in the end, I found the biggest challenge was to put yourself into a character that the energy was so high and so sort of macho, you know, without nary a second going by with a little chink in the armor.
The construction is very rigorous, not only because everybody has to dance, but also because the dancers need to breathe. Therefore, the construction is done in order to have a pas de quatre, a pas de trois, a variation, an adage, and you breathe, and you start again.
If there's a consolation to having to put your body through 2.5 hours of solid dancing, It's that in a ballet of such duration and of so many highlights, it's easier to get away with mistakes.
I often tell the dancers a 3-act ballet is an ensemble. Even if you miss something in an act, a variation or a little something in an adage, it doesn't matter because there's 3 acts and the public has forgotten the moment you've missed, because there's so many other things during these 2 hours. You've been the character, that you've been technically good, and that there's no need to be obsessive only about the technique. That's the advantage of ballets which have a storyline.
But the best part of this ballet is still the excerpt that made it to the West long before the rest came along, the Grand Pas de Deux.
When you do it by, by itself, sometimes in gals and things like that, it's different feeling because it's not the whole ballet, it's just the pas de deux. So you have to even put more the style in it, just to make, even because you don't have the scenery, you don't have anything, so you have to make it the right styles.
All of Don Quixote's bravado and fieriness is concentrated into this single dance. Dancers love its playful sexuality, a rare quality in the stately world of ballet.
I just loved the whole thing with the fan and the shoulders and the exuberance of it and the dash and spark and vivacity of that pas de deux solo. Wonderful solo with all the ending on point, doing that. Absolutely wonderful.
They say that the measure of a great actor is his ability to wring emotion from reading the telephone book.
Carpus, Alfred J. Murray Street, 555, 1259. Carpus.
I mean, a good actor, not the one we could afford. But in the same vein, the ballet version of Don Quixote is a testament not to the genius of Cervantes, but to that of Marius Petipa, who proves that he can create great dance out of the most unlikely of properties. As luck would have it, these two people are having an intellectual argument about ballet. One of them, the gentleman, is suggesting the great choreographer Marius Petipa wasn't so great, that he was simply what the French call un petit maître, somebody who perfected a certain style and never broadened the art's horizons. The other is incensed. She demands to know how you can call someone a petit maître when that someone virtually invented the form. They've decided to settle the argument.
Oh, yes. Pardon. Excuse me, sir. Is not the greatest artist who ever lived Jerry Lewis? Huh? N'est-ce pas?
Well, I guess my French isn't as good as I thought.
No, I did not say no.
This may be impossible, but let's try to settle the argument about just how great Marius Petipa was. He was a choreographer of classics like La Bayadere, the ever-popular and renowned Swan Lake, and the lavish, grand fairy tale, The Sleeping Beauty, amongst many others. Petipa developed a style that, while graceful and elegant, lacked imagination. So much so that his ballets were virtually forgotten by the time of his death. But just a few years later, his ballets were rediscovered, and dancers began to appreciate just how advanced his pet steps were.
Nowadays, our dancers today are technically so able that it's incredible. I mean, there isn't anything they can't do. I mean, they're almost like acrobats. But how on earth that choreography could have been done years ago in Petipa's time, I don't think the dancers were good enough technically to do it then.
It's so technically, physically exacting and unfairly demanding. And you say, can dancers really have danced this 100 years ago? But there is a uniformity and a continuity in those steps from Swan Lake and those steps from Sleeping Beauty and those steps from Bayadere that suggests that they were demanded of those dancers. And the genius of Petipa is that they are difficult 100 years later. Our technical standards have raised. We have physical abilities in the Olympics and in athletics that are far surpass even 50 years ago, and yet any classical dancer will tell you that there is nothing more difficult than ballets such as La Bayadere.
Looking back, it's hard to believe that this hugely important figure was obscured by his brother Lucien, a dancer with the Paris Opera. Lucien and Marius were born into a dance family. Their father, Jean, was a ballet master from whom the boys took lessons. At the age of 16, Marius left home to dance and staged ballets of his own in Bordeaux and Madrid. By the time he was 30, he was back in Paris, penniless and on the streets. Then came an invitation to the Imperial Theater in St. Petersburg, but only because his father, now a professor at the Imperial School, pulled some strings. In Russia, Petipa found himself dancing more than creating. Incredibly, he wasn't invited to choreograph in any significant way until 14 years later. But once given the opportunity, he made up for lost time. Over the course of the next 40 years, Marius Petipa would create over 60 ballets, including a handful that would stand up more than admirably against the telltale test of time. Which of Petipa's many ballets is his greatest is the subject of much debate. Gentlemen? Well, Swan Lake, without question. I disagree. There's no moment in Swan Lake like the Rose Adage in The Sleeping Beauty. Sleeping Beauty gets my vote. Well, are we talking about aesthetics or are we talking about audience appeal? Because if we're talking about audience appeal, it's got to be the Nutcracker. Well, if Petipa has a masterpiece, it may very well be La Bayadere. Oh, the Bayadere, of course. Oh, please.
I don't know anyone that doesn't see Bayadere for the first time and is not struck by the beauty, by the simplicity, the classicism of that ballet.
La Bayadere is the story of a warrior, Solor, who is in love with a Bayadere, an Indian temple dancer. But Solor is offered the hand of the Raja's daughter and is unable to refuse. The daughter, Gamsati, learns of Solor's affection for the Bayadere. She sends the Bayadere a basket containing a poisonous snake. The snake bites the Bayadere and she dies. In a dream, Solor follows the Bayadere to the kingdom of the shades, where he asks for her forgiveness.
Very, very hard ballet to perform from the technical standpoint. It's also a great dramatic challenge because it's a huge ballet with a lot of plot to get through and a lot of different moods to bring across to the audience, and it's just epic in every sense.
In fact, when La Bayadere premiered in 1877, the Russian critics awarded it 4 Tsars. La Bayadere is textbook Petipa. The components of his unmistakable style are all over it. Petipa had a genius for getting the most out of a minimal amount of steps. This is more evident in La Bayadere than in any of his other ballets. All through the course of this ballet, Petipa recycles the same basic dance vocabulary. They're the same basic steps his father taught at the Imperial Ballet School, steps that go back, in fact, to ballet's earliest years. Formative dance instruction, such as the kind taught in ballet companies around the world, first began here at the Paris Opera, where the reigning monarch, Louis XIV, established the world's first dance academy. It was entrusted to his friend and dance instructor, Pierre Beauchamp. Beauchamp got the ball rolling by defining the 5 positions of the feet. These 5 positions are the clay from which all other dance moves are made. Now, when Petipa became a choreographer, he built on this. The 5 basic positions of the feet are like 5 musical notes. Now, you can play with those 5 notes all you want. But you'll only get so many results. What Petipa did is he embellished the 5 basic steps of dance with techniques he had seen performed by traveling troupes of Italian dancers. In other words, Petipa added all of the notes in between. This established a wider dance vocabulary from which he would create some of the world's greatest and most musical ballets.
He made what appears to be a very economical choreography, very simple, but it is treacherous. It is technically terribly difficult.
Another facet of Petipa's genius is his work with the corps de ballet. While most choreographers of the time were content to have the corps simply frame the action, Petipa was the first artist to fully integrate the corps into the ballet. The corps would take on an immense stature in his later creations, like the Nutcracker, but the precedent was set in La Bayadere. Act 2, a dream sequence known as the Kingdom of the Shades, is a stunning vehicle for the corps.
The Shades scene, the whole second act, is a beautiful act. It can be sort of mesmerizing, and you know, you just sit there just hypnotized by these beautiful corps dancers. If they do it well, it can be fantastic.
For the audience, The intricate patterns of the core, whether in motion or in repose, create a hypnotic illusion.
When I began to understand the entire context of that excerpt was that it was supposed to be an opium dream. Then I understood the choreography and how it made your eyes, it made you kind of feel like you were on a trip somewhere. The way the girls cross, the way the formations play tricks with your eyes.
But for the corps de ballet, the Kingdom of the Shades act is more like a nightmare than a dream.
I think that for a corps de ballet, it has to be just a nightmare. I mean, the poor corps de ballet, they're beautifully dressed in spotless white tutus with veils, and they look lovely. But the poor things, they have to come down. I mean, if you're the audience, they come down the very steep black ramps, which gradually are diagonal, and they gradually reach the ground, the stage level. They start very high up, and they're painted black. So it appears that they are coming out of the sky, that they're not on an earth, they're not on the earth at all. But meanwhile, they have very strong white spotlights right in their eyes and shining up these ramps. And these poor girls have to come on, and they balance in what we call an arabesque. They take a pose on one leg, and then they take a back bend with the weight on the other foot. And they do this, I think it's something like 32 times, until all the girls are down on the ground level. By this time, they're nervous wrecks already, because the balance is already unfocused because of this white light that's been in their eyes on a black surface. They can't see where they're putting their foot because it's black. Finally, they get onto terra firma, and then Petipa has given them some extremely difficult choreography to do. To begin with, it's a corps de ballet, and they have to keep strictly in line with each other and keep the formations really, like a geometrical problem. And but then they are given these. I mean, Petipa was very cruel at this point. Having gone through this torture of an entrance that these girls have done, having gone through that torture, they then have to do things like what we call a développé. They stand on one leg, and the other leg very slowly is raised, and they have to hold it. And, unless the dancers are geniuses and as strong as horses, the audience can visibly see the supporting ankle is just wobbling like this, and the poor kids, are just terrified, and the tension is really awful.
Petipa was also a master of the grand pas de deux. In this same act, he creates that magic with a chiffon scarf.
I remember as a student watching that, I always thought it was the most beautiful part. Anyway, I don't know, and you'd think it would be sort of superficial to try and add something, but it was like their connection between them. The guy holding the scarf on one end, and it was like a connection between them without actually touching each other. which it was just a very beautiful movement, and it's great to try and perform it correctly.
Though La Bayadere can be described as the best of Marius Petipa, it also represents a radical departure. For Petipa, the ballerina was the focal point of ballet. But in La Bayadere, Petipa creates a male role that is not only central, but unprecedented in its depth.
La Bayadere is a ballet that is very rare. It's a work like Raymonda also too. And I can only think of 2 or 3 where the soul part of the role, of the male part, is as important, or perhaps even more important, than the ballerinas. Solor in La Bayadere is really, as his name is, the sun, the center of everything. And 2 main ballerinas go around him, Niquilla and Gamsati. If Solor is not well performed, La Bayadere loses more than 50% of its impact. It gives the opportunity for a male dancer to highlight virtuosity, to highlight classicism, the beauty of body lines, romanticism, a heroic temperament.
Ironically, the true essence of Marius Petipa may be just as elusive as the shade from Act 2. Though Petipa kept his own idiosyncratic notes, he lived in a time in which there was no recognized way of notating choreography. Which presents the question, is this
I sort of sometimes think about if when we're rehearsing a Petipa ballet, imagining him being in the room creating the ballet on us at that time, so that you're trying to think of how he must have worked as a choreographer in a room with his dancers. And it would have been, I'm sure, very like the choreographers of today, or at any time, really, working with dancers, working out a step, a series of steps, in order to convey something.
Today's choreographers run less of a risk of having their works lost. Over the last couple of decades, accurate methods of recording steps have been developed. These include a form of notation called choreology.
Choreology is the study and recording of choreography. So to define a choreologist's job, a choreologist becomes a choreographer's scribe, basically. Once they have recorded the material or the choreography, it's then their responsibility to maintain the quality and the integrity of the ballet once the dancers also know their parts.
There are 2 systems of notation by which choreologists record choreography. These 2 languages, if you will, are Laban and Benish. With Laban notation, you record the material as though you were observing it from above. With Benish notation, you record the choreography as though you were observing it from behind, and both methods use the musical stave.
The way the stave is used is similar to the way a musician uses it, in that you have bar lines with repeat signs, you have the beginning of a bar, and at the beginning you would have the time signature. But the stave is used completely differently.
The importance of choreology's role in helping to preserve ballets is obvious.
It would be like trying to bring a group of musicians together who
say, had played in a symphony and learnt their parts by heart, but nothing was ever written down. And a year later, you're expecting them to put it all back together and for it to sound exactly the way it did. That just wouldn't happen.
But despite its evident value, many dancers and choreographers still question the validity of choreology.
The danger is that in the accuracy of choreology, the accuracy of writing it down, it can get dry.
I once had a talk with Anthony Tudor about his ballets, and he talked about a version that was very meticulously recreated from notation and film and so on. And he said, they got the steps all right and the ballet all wrong.
People also ask, well, why do we need to have choreology in this day and age of videotape?
Now, looking at the same tape, I mean, you know that now when we have, in the legal process, when we can show a tape of someone in the act of some kind of crime or in the act of the police dealing with someone, that two people can look at that tape and see totally different things. So, it is a tool. Like other tools, it needs to be used judiciously, no pun intended there. And what we have that's much, much clearer is a systematic notation system that really tells you more of the truth. Now, what it can't give you is the style and background in the fullest sense.
It's a question, then, that may never be answered. Is La Bayadere true Petipa?
I've heard 1,000 different Russians say, I have the original version. And sometimes at one point you look at it and say, is it necessary to know the original version?
Maybe not. One look at the man's work and it's obvious that even a modest percentage of his genius is enough to carry an audience to incredible heights. It was towards the end of his life that the debate about Petipa's contribution to dance began. Among audiences and artistic directors alike, the great choreographer came to represent the old school. His final ballets, in fact, were scorned and ridiculed.
When we look at Petipa's later career, we have to remember that this is a man who was born in 1818. The fact of the matter is he died in his 90s, he was choreographing in his 80s. So in a sense, he lived beyond his own time. Because he was senior in position in the Imperial Russian Ballet, he had authority and he was expected to do the big projects. But eventually, time began to tick against him. And I think that it was fashion. Of course, also you have to bear in mind that it was a question of resources, too. The last days of the Romanovs were not perhaps as affluent as some of the earlier days of the Romanovs. And a lot of his work was predicated on spectacle, on giving an image that was balanced, symmetrical, and stable. It was, in a sense, a paradigm of the monarchy itself. And he was, as head of the Imperial Russian Ballet, as senior choreographer that is, he was responsible for giving a portrait of a serene society that would mirror the desires of the regime. And I think you have to look at those ballets in terms of their imperial aesthetic. And times were changing. The revolution wasn't very much down the road. In fact, already revolts had begun to break out, not at the time of Bayadere, but in Petipa's latter period. And so I think you find a man that had simply lived too long in his job. Although still a great craftsman, he was working with an aesthetic that no longer related to his time.
But time has proven kind to this great choreographer. Today, there isn't a dance star anywhere in the world who wouldn't tell you that nobody has done more for this art form than Marius Petipa.
For me, Petipa, it's one of the geniuses of our times. I mean, he is the father of the classical choreographies. So I have tremendous respect for Marius Petipa.
Case closed.